All right, good afternoon and welcome back after lunch. I hope everybody had an enjoyable time socializing, and welcome back also to those of you who are joining us online. If you're joining for the first time, I will reintroduce myself. My name is John Nimmers. I am the curator of our Panama Canal Museum collection here at the University of Florida. And we have a wonderful afternoon for you today. First, your amazing speaker is going to be me. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the collection's history and about what we do. You've heard some of this earlier today if you were participating, and for those of you in the room, of course, you heard some of this already. But I'm going to dive a little bit deeper in some of the activities that we work on here. And then following me, we're going to have a guest speaker who's joining us from Canada, and she's going to be talking about her research that she's done that's tied in with our exhibition out in the Panama Canal Gallery out in the hallway. All right, let me get started here. So the Panama Canal Museum collection, its origins actually start in 1998, right as the canal was being transferred. A lot of the Americans who were living in the canal zone, as they were leaving, coming back to the States, many of them coming back to the States, they decided that they were going to create a museum so that they could document their heritage now that there were going to be no more Zonians being born because, of course, the canal zone had ended a couple of decades earlier. So they created a museum, community-driven museum. It operated out of Seminole, Florida, which is near the Tampa-St. Pete area, for about 14 years. They did a lot of collecting, a lot of exhibits. They did a great job with a lot of that, considering it was a community organization. They didn't have professional museum staff for a lot of what they were doing. They actually built up a pretty sizable collection. Most of the donations came from their friends and family. So it very much represented the U.S. experience working and living in the canal zone and in Panama. But it also, and it's primarily the American experience, and so that's pretty much the 20th century, although they did collect, they did collect a little bit more of the railroad, gold digging era and the French era. They collected a little bit of that, but really what they were looking at was 20th century canal history. They realized at a certain point that they weren't sustainable as a museum, as a community museum. And so they started looking around for a partner, and they identified UF because we have a strong focus in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also because we have a very strong digitization program, which is something that appealed to them because they wanted to get their materials online. Long story short, in 2012, they shut their doors and we acquired their collection and created the Panama Canal Museum Collection, or as we call it, PCMC. I'm the curator currently, and Betsy Bemis is my associate curator. Betsy's over there. If you haven't met her yet, you should. But it takes, I mentioned this earlier, it takes an army to make this collection work. We have a lot of exhibit staff. We have a lot of librarians in our map and imagery library, in our Latin American Caribbean collection, and others who help us manage all that we do with the collection. Our focus is really on the personal stories. Now, we collect anything and everything, and if somebody gives me something cool that's an official government document, we take it. But the fact is that our focus is on personal stories. The National Archives, they have the official records of the canal. There are, of course, records in other repositories. The Department of Defense has some. There are records, of course, in Panama. There are other museums and other libraries and universities that collect in this area. So our collection, it's not comprehensive. We do collect in a very strategic way. We try and collect things that are going to help tell personal stories, personal narratives. We happen to be celebrating our 10th year this year, which we're happy about. So what do we collect? We collect anything and everything. We are very much a mixed collection in that we have books, we have archival materials, we have yearbooks, we have maps, we have photographs. You name it, we collect it. Now, that doesn't mean we take everything that's offered to us. We do decline things. We don't collect duplicates, for example, for the most part. And if somebody wants to give me their dry cleaning bill from 1972, I might question that and see what's the value of that. Betsy, by the way, would say, yes, take that dry cleaning bill. She wants everything. We do collect digital objects as well. And so if you have a treasure that you just don't want to give us, for example, we'll take a scan of it. We just want to make sure it's preserved and that other people can use it and make sure that the value that you see and that other people can take advantage of that value as well. On your tables, and we've got extras of these, I have distributed a most wanted list. It's one of the individual sheets of paper that's on your tables. This tells you a little bit more about what we collect. And I'm going to send this out to those of you online. I'm going to share this with you as well after the fact. I'll send you this. This tells you a little bit more about what we collect, the types of materials that we prioritize. So, diaries and journals and personal photos and letters, again, getting back to this idea of personal stories. But printed items, yearbooks, we were talking, Ed was telling us a story earlier about losing some commissary cards that got ripped up accidentally. We'd love to have those commissary cards. That'd be great for us to use in our exhibits. On the back, there are a list of our yearbooks. Yearbooks are very popular. Our users, there's a lot of people who are interested in their history, their family history, friends, and they use our yearbooks a lot. Many of these are online. I'm going to talk about these a little bit more later. I'm going to come back to yearbooks, but I just wanted to point it out that was on the back of that page. All right. So one of the things I wanted to mention, and we actually have had, for those of you here with us today, many of you were actually able to look at this and interact with it, but we do get some materials that are a little bit more, everything we get is special, but some of them are a little bit more special than others. And so here's an example of one of those where we have, and this was in somebody's personal collection. Somebody had this, brought it home evidently and kept it. And then years later, it was donated to the Panama Canal Museum, and then we inherited it. This is a silver roll. So this is a payroll ledger for the silver employees. And this is dating from 1944 to 1946. And you can go through this ledger and you can look and see all of the employee names and what they were paid. I'm going to actually, for just a second here, I'm going to leave and hopefully I won't break anything. This has been digitized, and you can go online and you can open this up. You can flip through this. You can look at all the names, and you can search. It's not perfect. The searching is not perfect, but it's pretty good. If we're looking for somebody and we're trying to get a name, I'm just going to put in the name that we were talking about a lot this morning. I'm going to put in Garvey, and let's just see if we get lucky there. No, okay, so I tried one that I should have tried before. But if you search the text, you'll be able to sometimes hit a name without having to browse through everything. Williams, okay. All right, and then we'd have to, let me try Frank Williams. Let me see. I don't know, I can't remember. Let me look at one page really quickly if they do them first name, last name. Yeah, they do, okay. That'll make it easy. I hear people yelling out names now. I'm not going to sit here and do all your names for you. Yeah, there's no, Frank isn't coming up, but of course it could be that it's F. Williams. And so, but we've got 21 hits for Williams, so it's possible that Williams is there. So let me go back to my PowerPoint now. I'm going to send that link out to everybody, by the way, so you can go. We had a lot of interest in that when we were showing it in the room a little while ago. So I'm going to share that, and you will be able to go one. Yeah, so I think this was monthly, I believe. Yeah, so yeah, monthly. So that's June, yeah, June 1 to June 30th up there, yeah. So they're getting paid in August for what they worked in June, it looks like to me. Yeah. Yeah. I'm guessing, well, yeah, I'd have to do a little bit more digging to see exactly what's the hourly rate you're looking at there, but maybe that person only did like an hour's worth of work or something, because 265 is low for 1946. The other thing we collect is we have a lot of photographs. One thing you can say about the Pan Canal Company is that they took a ton of photographs. A lot of them are in our publications, but many of them we just have as photographs. There's a good and a bad side to this. So the good side is we have a great deal of dozens, I'd go into the hundreds of photographs documenting Caribbean workers, Caribbean families, mostly workers, but also to a lesser extent families, and certainly communities, towns, and the town sites in the Canal Zone. It is all from the perspective of the Pan Canal Company, though. So, of course, all of the captions for these photographs and the way they were published was all the message of the Pan Canal Company. Sometimes that's good and fine, but other times we run afoul of descriptions that are less than flattering, or they're trying to make the activities of one group look good and another group not look as good. So sometimes the captions are suspect. It's something we deal with when we talk with researchers a lot. We have to first explain to them, like, you're going to get some captions here that don't make sense to you, because the example I use all the time is there might be a photograph of 20 people standing in a photograph, and the caption will say, like, Foreman Joe Smith standing at the dig. And there's no mention that the other 19 people are people who are Black. It's the one white person who gets a name and gets mentioned. And so it's something we deal with a lot. Researchers interact with that quite a bit, where they'll say, I need a photograph of something, and we'll send them a photograph that's just labeled steam shovel, but there happens to be 30 people standing behind the steam shovel who are people of color. It's great that we have the photos, and many times the description is not a problem. It's fine. But every once in a while, we do have to do a little bit of mediating when we share these with students and researchers, to say, just so you know, this is coming from a very particular perspective. So what do we do with these materials? One of our major functions is we support instruction. Now, for those of you who were participating earlier, you heard Professor Leah Rosenberg and her class talking about one of their class projects, but we support all kinds of instruction, and we get a very high demand for Caribbean-related resources relating to the Panama Canal. We have 3 to 5 classes per year on average that want to look at Caribbean-related resources. I'm going to really just quickly say, like, for example, last year in 2021, 2022, we had 9 classes total that we did, Betsy and I did teaching for. These are grad or undergrad classes. So out of those 9 in that year, 5 of them wanted Caribbean specific topics. So that shows you that the majority of our classes that are coming in, and that's typical for a year for us. That's just the last year that I'm reporting on. We have faculty like Leah Rosenberg. I don't know if Chris is still here. I can't remember. Chris Busey was in here a little while ago. No, he's left. Chris Busey, another professor here on campus. Heather Verana, who couldn't join us today, but has taught classes that we've presented for. They're coming from the Center of Latin American Studies, primarily coming from disciplines like history and art history and education. And they come to us and they want to know, what do we have? And we usually we set them up by saying, we've got some treasures. We do have some nice things, but we really don't have enough to tell the complete story. And so that's a message that Betsy and I tell a lot of times, is we wow them a little bit, and we show them, like we have the materials over here at the end of the room. We show them things like that, but we say, well, this really isn't telling the Caribbean story and the Caribbean voice from the Caribbean perspective. This is really telling the Caribbean story from the Pan Canal's perspective. But we do a ton of instruction. We also support a lot of research. We have a high demand, much like with instruction, we have a high demand from researchers for Caribbean resources. And again, I'm just going to tell you that last year we had 102 research requests, so people contacting us asking for help with research. Out of the 102, 61 were related to Caribbean research topics. So again, a majority. And again, that is an annual thing where every year that is the case. This is everybody from scholars to general public, genealogists, people who are just looking for family history. And we support everything from, you name it, we support it. So dissertations, books, digital projects. I mentioned earlier that we're very strong in digitization. We are the lead institution for the Digital Library of the Caribbean, or DLOC. And we contribute anything that we scan that we have the permission to. We have materials that we might not have copyright permission to put them online, but for anything we can put online, we contribute it to DLOC. And we define the Caribbean as the Caribbean basin. So it's not just the islands of the Caribbean, the island countries of the Caribbean, it's the Caribbean basin writ large. And so that includes, of course, of Panama. We have international partners. That what's great about DLOC is that it's all partners who come together and contribute, and it's all over the Caribbean, and it's in Panama. We have SAMAP. We've worked with, many of you know SAMAP in Panama. They are a contributor to DLOC. Most recently, just in the past couple of weeks, Melissa Jerome, actually who's in the back corner there, Melissa has been instrumental in getting the National Library, the Biblioteca Nacional in Panama to start. They've joined as a DLOC member, and we're starting to exchange. They're giving us material to put in DLOC, and they've requested materials that they would like to have as well preserved. And again, it's everything you can imagine. It's newspapers, it's yearbooks, it's photos. You saw examples of the workmen earlier in the student presentation, but I wanted to mention it to you again, that one of our most popular resources for people who are looking for information about Caribbeans by Caribbean people, the Workman is a great resource. This is a newspaper published by the West Indian community. It was a weekly. This actually is on DLOC, and it was contributed by Florida State University, which is a couple hours away from here in Tallahassee. This is an amazing resource. And this is where the students earlier got a lot of their articles relating to Milton Garvey. We have also examples of the Lebokin and other yearbooks. I know that we had many yearbooks on display a little while ago, and there are several online. These are an amazing resource. Not only can you go in and find a family member's photograph or a favorite teacher or something like that, but oftentimes the yearbooks have other information to them about what might have been happening in the community, what kind of events were happening, you know, celebrating Carnival, for example. And so they're an amazing resource for photographs, but also for individual histories and history of the education itself. I want to give a plug here because one person was instrumental in this, but a community came together to make it happen. A few years ago, a man named Emilio Collins was visiting and asking about our yearbooks in our Latin American Caribbean collection relating to PCMC, and said, well, how come these are all for Balboa High and for Cristobal and the other American schools? Where are all of the silver schools? And we said, well, we just don't have those. They weren't collected by the Panama Canal Museum. I keep hitting that, I apologize. They weren't collected, and we aren't getting any offers of them right now. And he said, well, I'm going to do something about that. So he put out a call, and a lot of people stepped up. As a matter of fact, who was I talking to earlier? It was Carlos. Where was he? Carlos, you still here? Okay, well, anyways, earlier I was talking to somebody who was in the room who was saying that they had donated their yearbook. And actually, it's Emilio. I said the wrong name, right? Emilio donated their yearbook as part of this effort, and it was digitized, and we were able to get many of these online. And that's why when you look at the back of this page that I handed out earlier, you will see over a good portion of these, I'd say 75% of these, it just says digital only beside it. That's because whoever owned the yearbook, they allowed us to borrow it to scan it, and then they kept the original. Now, some people, like Emilio, who was telling me earlier, he donated his copy. I believe it was the 1959 or 1960. I'm working off bad memory here. So we were able to acquire some original yearbooks, and we were also able to borrow some and get some scanned. Here's another example. This is the Apex from Silver City Occupational High School. These are online. You can look at these online. Oh, my image did not come up right there. I apologize. And that's not the image that should be there anyway. So ignore you don't see that image there. I mentioned earlier, and I'll just drill into this a little bit more. Supply does not equal demand. We have all of those instruction requests. We have all of the researcher requests. We have exhibits that Betsy's going to talk to you more about tomorrow, where we can't satisfy the demand for historical resources relating to the Caribbean story. And so, and again, that second bullet there, I want to underline that because the important part there is we want it from the Caribbean perspectives and voices. It's not just about documenting the Caribbean history. We're very interested in personal histories in everything we do. Many years ago, as we started trying to respond to this demand, we immediately identified some resources. And one of those was Roman's documentary Diggers, which of course was such an amazing film that came out and captured original voices and perspectives in exactly the way that researchers and instructors were demanding of us. So we would regularly present to classes and say, well, let us show you a clip of Diggers, and we encourage you to go watch the whole thing because it's just amazing from beginning to end. And we would also share it with researchers to say, this is the film you need if you want the voices of the Diggers. We also, there's been other oral history projects. Vanderbilt has had a project, Voices from Our America. They've got a Panama related project they've been doing longer than we've been trying to capture these original voices. And also the Gamboa Reunion Group. They had been documenting the town of Gamboa, and they had this amazing website. Actually, I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a second. I'm jumping ahead. I'm going to come back to that. So, as I mentioned earlier, and as Fran mentioned better than I mentioned, we started working together with Pan Caribbean Sankofa. And it's been an amazing relationship. And we immediately, in our brainstorming session, when we got together a few years ago, we said, if what we want is original perspectives and voices, the best way to do that is oral histories. And so we immediately said, that's our priority. We also want to do exhibits. We also want to do online exhibits, and we want to do programming and videos, which we've been doing. But oral histories was going to be our main thrust in order to capture those voices while we could. This is a shameless plug here for Betsy's session tomorrow. She's going to be talking about both exhibits and oral histories tomorrow afternoon. I'm not going to talk too much about oral histories right now, but I will say oral histories has helped us in another way because they've helped us acquire materials. Many people who have donated, who have donated their time with their interviews have also donated materials. They've given us their personal photographs. They've given us other documents and memorabilia that they have. We had a little reaction earlier when Lancelot's photograph came up. So that's Lancelot Llewellyn as International Boy Scout of the Canal Zone. So Lancelot actually, in addition to donating that photograph and some other scouting photographs, he donated some important documents relating to the IBSCZ. So now we have those preserved and they're available and people can learn more about what it was to be a scout. Marva Gordon, I got an example from Marva Gordon, who did an interview with us and gave us dozens of photographs. And again, gave us scans. She wanted to keep the originals. She gave us scans, but they're amazing and we can put them online and now people can see her family and they can listen to her interview and see the family members she's talking about. We also, as part of this project, we acquired the Enid Hill papers. I'm also just going to plug this, and I'm just going to say, I'm going to talk about more about this tomorrow. You're going to hear all about this in the afternoon session. Betsy and our student, Christine Reynolds, they're going to be talking about what we've been doing with Enid Hill. But I just wanted to say that that's a great example where Enid's family entrusted us with preserving those materials and making sure that we shared them with the world, and we're trying to do that now. Last thing, I think I'm drilling down to the end here, Gamboa Reunion Group, I wanted to mention, this was a different type of acquisition for us. This was something a little innovative, and it's for at least 6 years or so, my go-to resource if I wanted to know anything about Gamboa was I'd immediately go to the blog that the Gamboa operated, because they had photographs and they had done video interviews over several years, and they had building lists that list who was in each building. And it was just this amazing resource. And I went to it one day because I was helping a researcher and the site was down. It had gone away. And luckily, because I had met Carlos and Lean, who had come on the visits with Fran and gang, we were able to, I immediately called Carlos and I said, Carlos, your site's down. He said, yeah, we know, we got to repay, blah, blah, blah. And I was telling him, I said, this is my go-to site. We can't let this disappear. So we preserved it first. We made a copy of everything. But then I said, Carlos was explaining to me that the Cambodia, it was all volunteers. This is a volunteer group, that they were trying to ensure that it was sustainable, because if it didn't get paid next year or 2 years from now, it would go away. And I said, well, what would you think about us managing it for you? We would just put this on our website, and that way we're able to preserve it and the community can still contribute to it. And that helps us and our researchers even more. And so this is a little bit of a new thing for us. We just did this a few months ago, but it's now, their site is down now, and there was a redirect for a while. And now it's their site exactly as it was. It just has a UFL extension at the end now. So anyways, it's exciting for me because now I know this will be here. It's not going anywhere. There's some of the videos, by the way. This is an amazing resource. If you haven't gone in to look at this, they just, it was Carlos and his brother Leroy and Ricardo Millet and a few others. And they just went down and just video recorder and took interviews with a few dozen people over a few years. It's a great resource. All right. Questions and comments. And actually, I might hold our questions and comments for me, because I want to make sure, because our speaker's joining us. So I want to make sure that we get her set up and able to join us so I can introduce her. Let me hold my questions and comments till the end, if that's okay. I ran a couple minutes over. Thank you. All right, and Caroline, I think you can share your screen now. Make sure that's. Your screen looks much prettier than my screen. All right, let me. All right, and Caroline, one more thing really quickly. I don't know if you're intending this, but we're seeing your, not your presenter view, but your, working view.
Yes. Hi, John. Yeah, I'll set up the presenter view in just a moment. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you perfectly. Fantastic.
Wonderful. I just wanted to start my video so you can also see my face, but I'm getting a message saying we can't start your video because the host has stopped it. I'm not sure what might be going on there.
Let me see if I can fix that. I think I can.
Thanks, John.
There you go. Perfect. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your patience for this little transition. Fantastic. So what we'll do is we will, let me switch papers here that I'm using as my cheat sheet. Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. As I just mentioned in my curator talk, much of our work involves satisfying the needs of scholars, students, and other researchers. And I first met our next speaker, Caroline Leifers, when she visited UF in 2018 to conduct research for her doctoral dissertation. She was at Yale at the time working on her dissertation, her PhD, which she subsequently finished in 2020. And her research examined the history of disability and American imperialism. And she had visited our collection in order to look at injuries and amputation and deaths and those kind of topics relating to health and canal laborers. And Caroline, coincidentally, we were both down in Panama and we bumped into each other at the Miraflores Guest Center. But so that was the next time she came into my life. But then the third time was recently Betsy Bemis was curating our exhibition in our Panama Canal Gallery here on the history of healthcare. And of course, we immediately thought, well, we should talk to Caroline. So Caroline was a great help for us in talking through some of the topics we wanted to address in the exhibits and also helping us with some of the materials that we wanted to include. So Caroline comes to us both as an example of somebody who, as I was mentioning earlier about researchers and what we do to help researchers, but also as somebody who is a scholar and is trying to share information with the world about the history that we find so valuable. We thought she would be a perfect fit for what for our conversation today. So Caroline is now an assistant professor of history at King's University in Edmonton, in Canada. She's currently working on her first book, which again focuses on her dissertation topic of injury and disability and the Panama Canal. Some of her chapters in that are going to include compensation policies, the Corzao Asylum and Farm, Palo Seco leper colony. She also, by the way, she researches food history and the history of elder care in Canada and the history of childhood and child writers. So she's got a pretty diverse portfolio there. Probably that was a longer introduction than needed, but I want to introduce Caroline Leifers. Caroline, take it away.
Thank you so much, John, for such a kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here. You should be seeing my slides now, but please let me know if you're happy. Perfect. Thank you very much. So I want to start, of course, by thanking the organizers of this event for all of their hard work. And thank you all very much for being here today, whether in person or online. And I also want to extend my gratitude to the many, many people and organizations that have helped me with this research. Folks, of course, at the University of Florida Libraries, the National Archives at College Park, the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, the Barbados National Archives, the University of the West Indies, especially the Cave Hill Libraries there, the wonderful people at the Afro-Antillean Museum of Panama, and everyone at the Corazal Gatun Mount Hope Cemetery Preservation Foundation. Thank you all for sharing your expertise with me, and I really hope that I'll have the chance to meet a few more people today, perhaps through questions or the chat. Back in 2010, I was doing research in the Smithsonian Archives in Washington, DC, and I came across this enormous newspaper page in an archival folder there. It might not look like much from this distance, but this was a 2-page advertisement for the A.A. Marks Artificial Limb Company, and it was published in the New York Sun in October of 1911. The advertisement had a catchy title, Among the Rubber-Footed, and it promised that the Marks artificial limb would help amputees achieve successful social reintegration. In theory anyway, they would be able to do physical labor, play sports, and convince everybody that they were, quote, whole again. These were familiar themes for artificial limb brochures and advertisements. But a turn of the page took readers to a place that would have been unfamiliar, at least to many New Yorkers, the Panama Canal. The language was magisterial. The ad explained that, quote, this stupendous work has been planned and executed by brains, muscles, and machinery. But this immensity and drama had also come with a human cost. Workers, the ad admitted, met with, quote, accidents, premature blasts, railroad cars. Men were blinded and deafened. Fingers, hands, and arms were bruised and broken, and hundreds of legs lost. In the fantastic world of artificial limb advertising, this hardly seemed like a matter for concern. The ad was casual, even triumphant about these injuries, assuming that they could be easily fixed with an artificial limb and life gotten on with. But I suspected that the reality was probably much more complicated. As you likely already know, the American-led construction of the Panama Canal, officially running from 1904 to 1914, required tens of thousands of workers. They came from all corners of the globe, but most were from the Caribbean. Officially, there were nearly 20,000 contract laborers from Barbados and around 45,000 total, although the actual number of people who migrated to Panama in this period is probably much higher. Many excellent resources about the experiences of these workers, known as the Silver Men, have been produced. And of course, what you see here on the screen are just a few examples. I know also that the collections work, research, and current exhibit at the University of Florida libraries are brilliant testaments to the ongoing research and scholarship in this area. I'm working on a book, as you heard, that focuses on stories of injury and disability on the Panama Canal. This stunning new waterway was meant to facilitate a modern global American power for the new 20th century, but it also resulted in a lot of injuries. The exact number is very difficult to determine. The Canal Commission's annual reports didn't start to list injury numbers until 1908, and they made it very difficult to distinguish between, say, a mild fracture that kept a man off work for a few weeks versus a catastrophic injury that might end a man's ability to work for life. But even with these problems with the data, it's clear that the numbers are high. The annual reports from 1908 onward indicate no fewer than 1,800 non-fatal injuries each year. And at their peak in 1911, the number was over 5,000. A conservative estimate is that the canal construction caused more than 10,000 non-fatal injuries, and at least half of these would have been serious enough to keep someone off work for more than a few weeks. Another source of information are the ledger books, where the Canal and Panama Railroad administrators recorded the injuries that people received on a daily basis. My students and I have actually been working on transcribing these registers, which are housed at the National Archives, into a usable database. Like the annual reports, they're incomplete, but we already have over 8,500 entries, a daily parade of bruises and fractures, and often worse, that illustrates just how much danger hung over the workers. We plan to make these databases public in the near future when we're finished the transcription. But in the meantime, please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions, or if you'd like me to look up a relative. They may be able to be located in these spreadsheets. These tables and statistics begin to fill in the history, but only in the aggregate. And I think it's also important that we restore the stories of individuals, shining a light not only on the struggles that injured workers faced, but also their survival and the strength of their community. Most of these workers were from the silver rolls. As other scholars have observed, these were generally non-Americans, people of color, working on the isthmus on 500-day contracts, though the paperwork often went missing and it wasn't unusual for people to stay a lot longer. They were often classed unfairly as, quote, unskilled laborers, and they generally made far less money than white American workers. They were forced into inferior living conditions, and they often risked being deported back to their home countries if they were injured or sick or could not resume work. They also, of course, had a higher likelihood of injury. These men generally did the riskier jobs, like setting dynamite and helping to move tracks and load dirt and rock. Rufus Ford, who was a worker from Trinidad, testified that, quote, there are so many engines at a time in the cut that most every month that a man lost his leg or badly damaged. When anything like that happened, one engineer will turn to the next engineer. One just greased the wheel. In those days, a foul life was more valuable than our lives. My presentation today will begin by surveying the canal's construction and its injury policies in general. But I also want to show how these actually worked through the stories of 6 men: George MacDonald, James Chandler, Melford Hymason, Henry Gordon, William Alexander, and Milton Harding. They likely came to Panama drawn to the promise of money and an opportunity to work on the biggest infrastructure project anyone had ever known. All of them sustained injuries. And as I move through their stories, I'll show that the Canal Commission's approach to managing these was a mixture of humanitarianism, impatience, sometimes racism, and overconfidence in their ability to solve problems through technology. including artificial limbs. Those who stayed in the canal zone were expected to be productive, and injuries deepened the divisions that already existed between white and black, innocent and guilty, citizen and foreigner. These were binaries that defined life at this new edge of American empire. But as this presentation shows, these disabled men ultimately sought out their own networks of care and community, and they challenged the canal administrators' dismissiveness in creative and enduring ways. In 1904, the United States embarked on one of the greatest engineering challenges that the world had ever known, one that would solidify its position as a world power. The Panama Canal project seemed like the culmination of progress and potential. For his 4th of July speech in 1911, the chief engineer described the Americans as, quote, cutting a highway of commerce through what was a plague spot of the world. The US was what the Washington Post called a titanic remodeler, seemingly able to remake the whole world to ensure mobility for its military and trade. With the new canal, they would be able to move their naval forces and goods quickly between oceans, reducing the route from New York to Japan, for example, by over 3,700 miles, as graphics like this illustrated. The project was immense. They began by disciplining the landscape, draining swamps, killing mosquitoes, and initiating a whole-scale sanitation project. They continued with even more dramatic reshaping of the environment. An odd commentator after the canal's official opening in 1914 wrote, quote, never before had man dreamed of taking such liberties with nature. The greatest challenge of all, most famously, was the Culebra Cut, what the workers called Hell's Gorge. The numbers are almost beyond human comprehension. More than 100 million cubic yards of dirt had to be moved, needing some 60 million pounds of dynamite, massive steam shovels, and a complex railway system to bring men and machinery in and out and haul away hundreds of carloads of rock and dirt each day. Remodeling the landscape was not only a task for technology, it was also, of course, the work of people. As you see here, people who labored in the heat and dirt and noise and rattle of the machines. This human aspect was often given short shrift by journalists and official reports at the time, which were seemingly more interested in covering the achievements of the engineers and their nifty new technologies rather than the peril of everyday workers. But one visiting journalist did report on hospital cars. This 1913 article explained, quote, it is a common thing to see a stretcher or 2 or 3 taken out of this hospital car at Panama, upon which lies prostrate a human form, sometimes animate with only a foot or arm or head wrapped in bloody bandages. With the systematic dispatch that characterizes the whole organization, the stretcher is placed on the hospital ambulance and driven away, and the crowd quietly disperses. The matter has been of too common occurrence even to arouse comment. These men would be carried to one of the Canal Zone's American-run hospitals, and their case would be recorded in one of those injury register books that I showed you a moment ago. The United States started the Canal project with no clear injury policies in place. And as early as 1905, in October of 1905, this was starting to be a problem. Internal correspondence from officials pointed out that a couple of men had already been seriously hurt. Vernon Yarwood, a foreman, for example, had lost a leg, and a Barbadian carpenter, Edward T. Martin, broke his leg and injured his shoulder when a wall he was helping to assemble fell on him. At the time, the United States had no national workers' compensation law, and the federal government was technically exempt from any liability. But the administrators knew that this wasn't humane, and it would make for very bad publicity if they didn't provide some sort of compensation. Charles Magoon, who was the military governor of the Canal Zone at the time, argued, quote, it is of great importance that provision be made for the payment of some moderate, reasonable sum to employees of the commission suffering permanent injury in the line of duty. They created policies to give up to 30 days of paid sick leave per year to injured gold workers. These were generally white Americans. It wasn't until July 1st, 1907, almost 2 years later, that the silver workers received any official injury coverage at all. At one of their meetings, the Isthmian Canal Commission passed a resolution that declared that they would extend the gold policy to silver men as well. They could now be paid for up to 30 days of work lost each year on account of injury. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And almost immediately, the minutes of the commission's meetings show that a couple of silver workers asked for and were granted retroactive payment for injuries that happened just before this policy came into effect. But 30 days of paid sick leave was likely little comfort to someone who might be facing, for example, the amputation of both legs and a lifetime of lost earning potential. And it's surprising that the minutes of the commission's meetings don't show more men applying for this retroactive compensation. Maybe they weren't aware it was possible. Maybe it only happened under exceptional circumstances. Maybe they had already left the isthmus to return home to the care of their families. And the injury registers also suggest that it took a while for this new policy to be implemented, and it was never adequately funded. In 1908, the United States Congress passed the first real injury compensation law for the Panama Canal, as well as for other branches of the federal government. This one entitled men to receive up to 1 year's pay in compensation for their injuries. But there was a catch. The injury had to be deemed to be not the worker's own fault, and it had to have occurred in the official performance of their duties. And again, people who were injured prior to this were just left out, and the money was hardly enough. In a 1913 letter, Chief Engineer Goethals wrote to the Secretary of War about an American who had lost his leg in the construction. He expressed his concern that 1 year's pay cannot compensate a man for so serious an injury. We have a great many injured employees on the isthmus that we cannot take care of with positions here, although we are taking care of as many as we can. The canal administrators actually had made a good faith effort to find jobs for disabled men where they could. Many worked as switch tenders and watchmen, for example. And by 1912, we know there were at least 200 permanently disabled men, many of them silver workers, who were on the job on the canal. Managers did not always appreciate them. A district quartermaster complained that, quote, his department has always been burdened with an excess of cripples. Disabled people who had already sacrificed their bodies for the canal were being held to impossible standards of productivity. As the project wrapped up, too, these positions became harder and harder to come by, and administrators were trying to get employees off the isthmus and out of their care. A new compensation law in 1914 offered a more generous pension for disabled men. They could be paid about half of their normal wages for up to 8 years, depending on, of course, the severity of their injury. Many men took this money as a lump sum and went back to their home country. In fact, the governor encouraged this. We have some examples of where he would actually withhold the compensation until the person agreed to go home. And finally, in 1916, Congress passed a thorough new injury compensation law, which offered a lifetime pension of up to 2/3 of lost earning capacity to any injured worker. This too was often paid as a lump sum for people who were repatriated. This could be really valuable for workers. One man received $1,360 and transportation back to Barbados with his wife and stepson, which the board hoped would allow him to, quote, engage in some business or occupation requiring a little capital. But there were often concerns about the fairness or unfairness of the claims process. The injury percentage was based on the judgment of an injury compensation board, which would review the case and make recommendations. And the Panama Canals Board was reportedly less generous than the US equivalent that was up in Washington. A Jamaican worker, for example, who lost his leg when it became entangled in towing wire was assessed as 33 1/3% disabled. But this was lower than the 44% average if you had a similar injury before the board in Washington. And the acting governor even questioned whether the man's percentage should be raised, but the claim officer was not willing to change the assessment. The British West Indian Employees Association, which was founded in 1924, did important advocacy work to help laborers fight for what they were owed. A report to the British government stated that many workers, quote, are not even presented with a copy of the act to which their contracts refer, nor are such copies available. Not only are they in no position to press for their rights, they're never sure as to what those rights may be. The Employees Association was essential to helping protect these workers. In 1917, Congress also created a special fund of $10,000 for, quote, alien cripples. These were generally people who were not eligible for other compensation, but to get any payment from this fund, you had to be willing to go back to your home country. As the governor put it, these payments would, quote, give them enough money to get started in their homes when they get back. In one sense, it is a gratuity, but in another sense, it relieves us of a constant burden. One man had lost his leg in 1914, for example, and was now experiencing heart problems and epilepsy. He was granted a lump sum of $400 and repatriated to Barbados. But not all men accepted the compensation that was offered. Some thought it just wasn't enough. For example, a man who was working at the district quartermaster's furniture shop, making 15 cents an hour, refused the paltry $50 that he was offered to return to Jamaica. In another case, the worker just didn't want repatriation, so he never showed up at the auditor's office to claim his award. Perhaps he had family and friends in Panama that he didn't wish to lose. What other compensation or support existed for injured men? Well, as I've indicated, they could receive artificial limbs and other medical appliances. With the first amputations in 1905, the commission gave out peg legs. But starting in late 1907 or perhaps early 1908, they began providing proper artificial legs instead, probably assuming that these would make it easier for men to go back to work. By 1912, they provided over 200 artificial limbs, and many of the recipients were ostensibly able to get back on the job. This early history of the Panama Canal even included a photo of one such man. A.A. Marks, who we saw earlier advertising his product, was a key provider of these prostheses from the start. Despite competition from other US-based manufacturers, the canal administrators seemed to favor Marks's limb because they thought it was better and cheaper than other competitors, and particularly good in humid conditions. And the company also courted the Panama Canal's business aggressively. A representative made at least one trip to Panama, presumably to shake hands and grease the wheels of bureaucracy. And the company also offered incentives like fitting kits. I found this image of one on the internet, for example. Marks was even willing to accept orders for artificial limbs based on measurements rather than requiring a cast. And this was a big advantage because shipping was inconvenient and plaster could often crumble in the humidity if it wasn't properly shellacked. The company would even replace limbs that had measurement errors and make other alterations and corrections for free. And to fit the canal zone's diverse population of workers, Marks even offered various color options. Marks also was able to benefit from their relationship with the canal zone's administrators. It was an exciting marketing opportunity. In medical journals and newspapers, the company boasted that their waterproof leg was the only one that was suitable for the hard work and humid climate in Panama. And the company promised to send, quote, an attractive little book showing the canal with map in colors, free to any doctor who will request it. I've not been able to get my hands on one of these books, but if anyone knows where I can find one, I'd be delighted to hear about it. Marks's advertisements often featured woodcuts of the massive steam shovels and the staggering culebra cut, positioning his prosthesis at the forefront of technological achievement. Presumably to avoid any complicating questions about who was actually doing the work on the canal, the laborers were depicted as white. The United States, in this understanding, used machinery to remake the man as it remade the landscape. Ideally, the Canal Zone was the epitome of American ingenuity and drive, a site where both the artificial limb and the ambitious nation could fulfill their potential. Historians have argued that the Panama Canal presented an exceptionalist narrative of US imperialism. What I mean is that promotional articles and other canal publicity materials generally cast the country's project in a benevolent and humane light. It was a show of American strength without American threat. Injury compensation, employment for disabled workers, and artificial legs seemed to reinforce this message. But when we look more closely at the records, we can see how justice and dignity for people injured in the canal project were often intimately tied to whether or not they could help the state achieve its larger goals. And this American benevolence had complexities and limits. National and racial prejudice, assumptions about guilt and responsibility, and bureaucratic entanglements reduced the injured men in a lot of cases to balance sheets of social cost and productivity. Sometimes in the archives, a voice speaks to us from over a century ago. In May of 1913, the Jamaican laborer Wilfred MacDonald wrote this letter to the canal administrators. He said, "I have been serving the ICC, Isthmian Canal Commission, and the PRR, that's the Panama Railroad, in the capacity as trainman from the year 1906 until my misfortune, which is 1912. Sir, without any fear, I am speaking nothing but the truth to you. I have no claim coming to me. But for mercy's sake, I am begging you to have mercy on me by granting me a pair of legs, for I have lost both of my naturals. I has a mother, which is a widow, and 2 motherless children, which during the time I was working, I was the only help to the families." MacDonald signed his letter, "Your truly subordinated client," which I think testified all too accurately to the way he felt in the face of the canal's imposing bureaucracy. Unfortunately, MacDonald had lost his legs outside of his official duties, so legally he was entitled to absolutely nothing. But the canal administrators realized that they risked creating a population of public charges if they didn't provide some assistance. They decided that they should be allowed to give these injured workers peg legs when it was in the canal's interests to do so. Peg legs might help them at least earn a livelihood. They were cheaper and more durable than the fancy legs from A.A. Marks, and Marx's attractive and sophisticated limbs seem to have been reserved for those who were deemed not liable for their injuries. But MacDonald was actually an exception here. He had a double amputation, so it would have been very difficult to get around, let alone work, with just peg legs. So the head of Cologne Hospital actually explained that 2 of A.A. Marx's legs would cost just $150, that's $75 each. And it would cost the commission over $300 a year to keep this man in the hospital. They were very clear that MacDonald's case was not to be a precedent, but they decided to give him the expensive limbs nonetheless. A similar case was the Barbadian William Phillips, who was only 29. He was eating dinner with his brother in the shade underneath a train when it began to move. His brother was killed, and both of Phillips' legs were crushed to the extent that they needed to be amputated. The chief sanitary officer explained that Phillips was, quote, young, strong, and will probably be able to earn a livelihood with artificial limbs. So they gave him a pair for free. But most men, I have to stress, were offered much less than this. In June of 1909, for example, the Barbadian James Chandler lost his right foot, but it wasn't while he was working. There's not much detail in the file, but maybe he jumped off a labor train while it was still moving. That was a really common thing that would happen. He was released from the hospital on crutches, and he relied on his friends and schoolmates to band together and help him purchase an artificial leg so he could return to work. But after several years, it needed a replacement. He pleaded his case to the chairman in this handwritten letter. He said, "I worked as switchman and flagman in sun and rain, and the leg is now broken all down. I'm supposed to work on crutches again, which is very distressing and hurtful. I am begging you, sir, to do your level best in helping me with an artificial leg." Chandler also took pains to describe his work as, quote, "for the United States of America government with their canal. During that period of time, I worked pretty hard and obeyed orders so far as concerned." Chandler savvily understood that appealing to the significance of this national project of canal building, as well as his work ethic, might help garner sympathy. In this case, the commission didn't want to set a precedent, and they offered only a peg leg. But I think this story is also really important because it offers a glimpse of the social life and community of workers in the Canal Zone, particularly those from the Caribbean who formed deep networks of friendship and care that helped men through times of crisis, as in this case, when they came together and pooled their money to buy Chandler his first artificial limb. There's a similar example in the case of Melford Hymason. He was from Costa Rica, and he was struck by a train while in the line of duty on the morning of March 10, 1913. 1913 was actually the most disastrous year for Canal Zone amputations. He was only about 22 years old, and his right foot was gone. He received an artificial leg, but only 2 years later, he complained that it was unserviceable. It was probably worn out from hard physical labor. The commission, which was trying to save money, offered him a peg leg as a replacement, but he wasn't satisfied. He worked as an office helper, and he used his earnings to buy his own A.A. Marks artificial legs in 1917, 1926, and 1931. He was unafraid to ask the commission to send them back if they didn't meet his expectations for quality or comfort. And in one case, he wrote that his limb was, quote, "something no human should have worn." In 1934, he was in negotiations yet again to get a better fit for his artificial limb. This time, the head of Gorgas Hospital's surgical division had had enough. He wrote, quote, "We have spent more time and money on this complaining letter-writing employee than he is worth. Recommend 1, issuing him a pair of crutches if he will not wear his new limb, and 2, deportation to Costa Rica." But Hymason persisted, safe in a community of allied workers, workers who may have helped him even perhaps purchase some of these legs. I found a record that in 1959, he was the master of ceremonies for the Canal Zone Retired Workers Association. And he passed away in Panama City, age 74, in 1966. He had defied the administration and their prejudices. He was not the only disabled laborer to forge his own future. As the First World War loomed, some workers perceived new opportunities for leverage. One of them was Henry Gordon. We know very little about him because unfortunately his employment record is very damaged. But in 1916, he led a group of 6 workers who called themselves, quote, "the crippled men of the Panama Canal." With Gordon and his beautiful penmanship taking charge of the writing, they produced this letter to US President Woodrow Wilson. They explained that they had been, quote, "hurted on the PC," and in many cases were now out of work. They were part of the downsizing of the labor force as the project was wrapping up. But they were very savvy. They wrote, quote, "that it's not a case of impossibility about war being declared on USA government at any time. My lord, do you believe that when these able-bodied men see the treatments of a poor crippled, they would ever devote their energies to perform the duty of a noble hero to which their country had given them a natural liking? How would the US recruit volunteers for an impending war when they evidently did not respect people who sacrificed their bodies for the sake of their country?" These men, led by Gordon, also wrote in moving terms about the cruel spiral of poverty that they had been forced into. Gordon explained that he had previously been making 25 cents an hour, then had been reduced to 10 cents, and finally fired. Without money, these men would not be able to buy food, much less replacement artificial limbs so they could keep working. They wrote, quote, "My lord, King Pharaoh had his time in treating the poor just like this, but he never thought his time would come to such an end and such a place." They used powerful rhetoric to plead their case. These men had been told, too, that their only option was what they called the farm. This was a reference to the, quote, cripple farm at Corozal. You see, around 1910, Chief Engineer George Goethals, who was usually a businesslike man, had come down with an inconvenient case of compassion. Two men's lives were weighing quite heavily on him. Emil Miller, who was an Austrian who lost his eyesight in a construction accident, and James Todd from Barbados, who lost both of his legs. These men were no longer able to work, and they were supposed to be deported. The Canal's policies allowed administrators to kick out anyone who was chronically ill or disabled and deemed likely to impede the work of the Canal, as long as they had arrived after the US took control of the Canal Zone. Goethals wrote that while he was legally allowed to deport them, quote, "I hesitate to cut these men adrift in their present helpless condition. Before establishing a precedent in these cases, I would prefer to submit the facts to Congress and request an appropriation to establish and maintain on the isthmus an asylum in which laborers who have been permanently disabled in the construction of the canal may be taken care of." By 1912, plans for a farm at Corozal, not far from Panama City, were in place. It was close enough to headquarters to be convenient, but far enough away that the disabled men would not be in public view. The space could also be used by patients from the nearby mental hospital. Corozal had hundreds of acres and some pre-existing fruit trees and cleared areas for crops and grazing. What the administrators didn't mention was that the work of making this into a usable farm had actually largely been done by the locals who held the land prior to the American takeover. By 1914, though, there were 56 disabled men on site, and 45 of them were of Afro-Caribbean origin. The numbers hovered around the same level into the late 1920s. A, quote, army of cripples, as the Isthmian Canal Commission's chief clerk called them, would do things like grow vegetables and fruit and roses that were sold at the commissaries. They took care of pigs, poultry, as you see here, and there was a dairy that provided milk to the hospital. And they even raised guinea pigs and briefly rabbits that were used in local medical laboratories. Later, the men also began making and selling brooms, and they occasionally dug graves for the cemetery. The farm's inhabitants were technically supposed to be ex-employees of the canal, although others were often let in as well. Those who could work were paid, but not much. Black laborers started at only 3 cents an hour, and whites at 5 cents. Those who couldn't work were given only basic food, clothing, and housing. The application for admission required them to acknowledge, quote, that you are expected to work to the best of your ability to hold your place, and that idlers will be deported. The residential buildings were reportedly quite dilapidated. They were often repurposed from jails or barracks or even old barns. Though the men were at first allowed to have wives and children with them on the farm, the challenge of managing and housing them led the administrators to phase this out after only a few years, though they did sometimes get railway passes to visit loved ones off-site. The farm got very little mention in the Canal Zone's annual reports, even into the 40s and 50s, and it's very difficult to find photos of its inhabitants. I'm really grateful to the University of Florida Libraries for helping me locate a few. The administrators, I think, would have been happier to forget that this space ever existed. It defied and frustrated their focus on speed and modernity. But the workers had their own lives, their own feelings, their own voices, and they advocated for themselves. Sometimes they protested and refused to work. In 1916, after a bout of labor unrest, they were invited to send a representative to testify on their behalf before the wage board. The men at the farm chose William Alexander, who read a statement that expressed concerns about poor food, insufficient rest time, and beds that were difficult for men to get in and out of, as well as their desire for artificial legs rather than peg legs to let them do their best work. William Alexander was from Dominica. He was injured way back in 1905 while attempting to board a labor train, and he lost his lower left arm. We know that by the time he was at Corozal, he also had a 6-year-old daughter. He was ambitious and brave, and clearly was a natural leader and spokesperson among the Afro-Caribbean workers. These men were very active in pleading their case. They followed up when their complaints before the wage board were not addressed, and they wrote countless letters about their low pay and poor living and working conditions on the farm. In 1918, one group wrote to complain that they were not allowed to take time off without giving 3 days advance notice. They wrote, quote, "Sir, we do not know what day in the week we will feel weary." And they also commented on the inappropriateness of intense physical labor, given that many of them were disabled. They signed their letter, quote, "Cripples," a testament, I think, to a new shared identity that bound men together on the farm. The same year, 18 of the farm's 52 inhabitants actually decided to stop work in protest of the food, which they complained consisted of bad tripe, sour bread, boiled bananas, and weak coffee. There was strength in numbers, and they were moderately successful in improving their circumstances. In other letters, men asked for better underwear, shoes, and the option to wear something other than blue denim uniforms. In another case, a group of them writing en masse as, quote, "cripples with families," bemoaned their poor wages. It was unfair they should be paid so little when, quote, "profits have been reaped from our work." Though the farm didn't make much, if any, profit, they were certainly right that they were not fairly compensated. And they were especially frustrated that their wives and children were paying the price because of their disability. They were not afraid to find their voice and speak out against their inhumane treatment, especially when their family's welfare was at stake. A report to the chief sanitary officer groused that, quote, "There are 54 so-called cripples at Corozal Hospital. These men cause more worry and are more irritating to the hospital superintendent than all the 367 insane patients, and take up from 1/3 to 1/2 of his time. Discipline is almost impossible among them. They are always complaining and make themselves a nuisance to the superintendent and everybody in general." Perhaps they were a nuisance, but they were unwilling to be forgotten, unwilling to be ignored. In 1917, word made it to the farm that lump sum payments and repatriation might be possible, and some men picked up their pens to express their wishes. "We have learned that something is to be issued by His Excellency's permission, and we will be very glad to return to our native land on His Excellency's earliest opportunity after settlement," wrote a letter from 4 men. Another said bluntly, "We are not at liberty here. We would like to go to our country, our home, sweet home, land of liberty." Ironically, they were using familiar American language of freedom to achieve their goals. But repatriation could be challenging. Many of the British colonial governors strongly resisted admitting people who had been in the Canal Zone for more than 10 years, especially if their disability was connected to their work for a foreign country. And many workers also didn't have citizenship papers that could prove their country of origin. For those who stayed on the farm, activism was really important for ensuring quality of life, and they became increasingly savvy and organized. The Corozal Colored Cripples Association was founded on April 26, 1918. They met in the library of the farm workers' quarters twice a month. Their approach was generally cautious, with the goal of enforcing good behavior to gain respect and presenting a united front when they had grievances. Quote, "Members will be required to cooperate to the best of their ability with the superintendent and their other immediate superiors at the farm in order to develop a deserved sympathy from such superiors and to help in bringing into effect a smooth working in this department of the hospital." Though some people would have probably preferred a more radical approach, these men knew their audience, and they worked within the system to achieve their goals. Their first president was, no surprise, William Alexander. He was evidently a vocal organizer, but he was soon given $250 and an offer of repatriation to Dominica, which he decided to take. William King took over, and the organization expanded to include all disabled Black people employed by the Panama Canal or the Panama Railroad. It is a matter of right that all the above-mentioned cripples be in touch with each other and be in a position to help each other, King wrote in this open letter to the Panama Star and Herald. It is a matter of fact that we should know each other through a suitable union. The organization was not only about managing their relations with administrators, it was also a way of formalizing their commitment to helping one another in times of trouble. They used their dues to purchase artificial limbs, provide allowances to individuals and families in cases of sickness or death, and give loans when people needed them. Community was key to survival, advocacy, pride, and dignity for these disabled workers. My last story today is that of Milton Harding, whose career exemplified the experiences of so many disabled workers. I don't have any photo of him or any letters that he wrote. Like so many, he left precious few traces. But we know he was from Barbados, and in 1908, he was running a drilling machine when his left hand was injured. The accident happened just 8 days after the new 1908 injury compensation law came into effect, but even so, he was owed only $32.40. He was reassigned to a watchman position, but in 1914, he was discharged along with hundreds, perhaps thousands of other workers as the administration downsized. But he still made a living. He worked for the United Fruit Company and other small contractors and returned to the Canal Zone in 1927 at age 46, where he was granted admission to the cripple farm. He soon learned that the canal administrators were willing to pay disabled aliens one-time sums if they would leave the isthmus. As one administrator said, when figured out, it is much cheaper for the government to pay these cripples off and repatriate them than pay a monthly wage, feed, house, and supply hospital supervision. So Harding appeared before the Alien Cripple Board, which granted him $250 and a ticket home. His compensation was too little and very late, but he was a survivor, and he was returning to the island of his birth. I don't know what happened next, but I certainly hope he found happiness. An article in the Panama Star and Herald in 1921 dared to reckon the cost of the Panama Canal in human legs. Over 400 had been lost since 1905, not to mention the many other injuries that would have occurred on a day-to-day basis. As the AA Marks advertising so proudly noted, quote, "A work of this magnitude, though conducted in the most careful way, means the loss of many legs and arms." This early history of the Panama Canal that I quoted before called injuries the, quote, "unavoidable penalty for progressive operations of any great magnitude." Though the injury policies did grow more generous as the project went on, they were hardly enough. And community and collective advocacy were essential to ensuring a better quality of life. John Oswald Butcher, who left Barbados to work on the canal in 1906, wrote this, quote, "As I recall those horrible construction days that were so full of sacrifice and hardships, I firmly believe that all of the West Indian survivors, and particularly those who contributed so much of themselves before water was let into the canal, should always be especially remembered and kindly treated." They were not always kindly treated, but I think we can certainly do much to remember them. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Caroline. That was fantastic. And we have time for some questions and discussion. So I'm going to do two things here. I'm going to turn on the lights for those of you here in the room, and I'm going to walk around with the microphone. And we're also checking questions online. So if somebody would like to get us started, and if you have a question or a comment to share with Caroline in the group. Sorry about the, I guess I should have warned you. I said I was going to do it, but I should have warned you. It's about to happen. Lights coming on. Any questions for Caroline or comments? Yes. I got more of a. Caroline, I'm walking around with a microphone, so give me a second to get a feed for it. There you go, Margaret.
Of course, no
Yes.
problem.
My grandfather suffered the loss of a leg, and he had the prosthesis. And I remember that that thing was very heavy. And I think they had 9 children, and they lost their privilege on the Canal Zone, and they had to move into the city. He did not return to Barbados. They decided to remain in Panama, but he had to find other means of supporting his 9 children.
Thank you for that comment. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Repeat the name of the person, last name, Harding? Oh,
Yes.
the Harding, what was the name of the first name of the Harding?
His name was Milton Harding.
Milton? Okay,
Yeah.
that's all.
Milton Harding. Yes, okay. Question over here.
Will there be a ledger online to find all of the name of the crippled society members?
Oh, thank you so much for all of these comments and questions, and that's a particularly good one. Yes, so my sort of first project that I'm working on right now with my students is we're transcribing the injury registers, and we are going to try to get those online. I'm actually, I don't want to make any promises I can't keep, but I'll probably be in conversation with John about what our options are in terms of getting those online so people can search them. And we also have the photographs from the original ledgers, so you could look at the spreadsheet and also look at the photograph. Your question is particularly, thank you, about the people who were at the Cripple Farm. As Cripple Farm, I'll put it in quotes, right? But that's an excellent thought, an excellent idea. I can certainly work on putting together some resources that will list people. The population changed obviously from year to year as people left or passed away or arrived or moved out, whatever. And so I'll have to think of the best way to organize that information. But I think that's a really, really wonderful idea to create a resource so that people can potentially look up the names of family members who may have been living there. So thank you so much for that suggestion. And I also want to thank the previous 2 people as well for their really great comments. The point that was made just very briefly about the leg being heavy is something that I've come across a lot. The company liked to suggest the leg was feather light and it would be so comfortable to wear, but we know that the reality is that that wasn't true. They were quite heavy and could actually be quite uncomfortable. And so that's a really important comment. I'm really grateful for it. Thank you.
Caroline, this is
Yeah.
Betsy. Hey, how are you doing?
I'm well, thanks.
Good, lovely to see you. I actually had a question in reference. Do you know if, I know that Corozal is separated out in the census. Do you know if they differentiate in the census records patients versus employees that lived and worked there? And if that would be a way for people to try to find, that just kind of came to mind. And I had never looked into it myself, but I thought I would mention it.
That's a great suggestion. To be honest, I've never approached it from that direction either, but I will certainly look into it. There are also a lot of records at the U.S. National Archives in College Park, Maryland from the Corozal farm. And sometimes, you'll be flipping through the pages and you'll come across a list of everyone who is currently at the farm on a given date. And so when I come across a record like that, that would be perhaps a really good one to digitize and to make searchable for people looking for family members. So really wonderful suggestions. Thank you.
And Caroline, we have a question, a comment online. They just missed your explanation of what the Cripple Farm was, and we're putting that in air quotes again when we say Cripple Farm, but could you just succinctly explain what that was again?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. So essentially, in about 1912, 1913, this space that was several hundred acres actually opened in Corozal, and it was shared between the men with disabilities and the asylum that was at Corozal. So the idea was that for people who were getting mental health care at the asylum, that the farm could kind of serve as this therapeutic space. This is very idealistic, but a therapeutic space where they could do some work out in the great outdoors and also potentially help to offset the cost of running the asylum. But it was also a space where disabled men could live and work as well. Sometimes the populations kind of resented having to share the space with one another. I didn't get into those details, but there are certainly examples of the disabled men feeling that they were, stigmatized, right, because of the association with the hospital. But yeah, they shared this space together, and the farm did all sorts of different things. So they grew vegetables and fruits and roses that were sold at the commissaries, raised chickens, dairy farming. So a whole bunch of different things that were meant to provide an opportunity for people to do some kind of productive labor, because of course the canal administrators did not want to just give people anything for free, right? They wanted them to be working for it. That was very much part of their mentality. So I hope that helps answer the question succinctly.
Hi, Caroline, Fran here. How are you?
Oh, it's wonderful to hear your voice. I'm doing very well, thanks.
Thank you. Caroline, did the farm have predominantly single crippled men, or were there families that lived on the farm? You mentioned one person having a child, but were there families on these farms?
That is such a wonderful question. So briefly, yes, for several years, there were families. People's wives and children could be living on the farm with them. But the administrators tended not to like it. I guess there were a few cases where families were kind of arguing with one another, or they were seen to be a distraction, or they were asking for better quarters that the administrators of the farm didn't want to provide. And so after several years, the administrators just said this basically isn't worth the trouble, and they no longer allowed people to have their families on the farm. I did find some records indicating that they would give people train tickets so they could go visit their families off-site from time to time. But yeah, many people would have to live away from their families. In some cases too, I also have records, these are very patchy, but I have some records of people, it seems, who were living with their families off-site, but then coming to the farm to work. So these are very patchy. I really don't have much detail there, but that may have happened from time to time. Yeah, so in terms of what percentage of men had families, it's hard to say because that's not always well recorded. But certainly, even if they were living on the farm and their families were away, the families were not forgotten, right? They were writing these letters to the farm administrators asking for better pay, asking for better allowances that they can, pass over to their families to pay for food and other things that their kids would need. So even if they had to live apart from their families, I see so much evidence of them fighting for their wives and kids, right? Caring so passionately for them. And it's really important and really moving.
Hi, Caroline. This is Roman Foster. By 1913, most of the heavy work had taken place in the canal. But you mentioned that year had the highest rate of canal amputations. Is that what it was?
That's correct.
What do you attribute that to, since most of the heavy work had already been done?
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, in terms of the numbers, I believe it was 93 legs were lost, recorded to have been lost anyway, in that year. And so that was the highest number of any year in the construction. That's a wonderful question though, why? And to be honest, I don't know. I hadn't given it that much thought. What I might have to do is take a look at the injury registers and see if perhaps there's a pattern emerging about certain kinds of work in 1913 resulting in that injury. So I'm sorry I don't have a more comprehensive answer, but I just want to thank you for such a wonderful question, and you're kind of encouraging me to go back and take another look at the records. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And
thank you.
I'm a big admirer of your work as well, so thank you.
Caroline, I know we're right at 4. We have a couple more questions. Are you okay to keep going for a couple minutes? Are we good on your time? Okay, great.
Fine, thank you.
Hi, Carolyn. I'm Sheila Clark Wilkinson from Panama. You said that I know it was mentioned that some of the people didn't get any help. What happened to those that didn't go work on the farm and had amputees? What happened to these people? Because I know for a fact, I lived on the Canal Zone until I got married. And if your parents lost their jobs because of contraband or your father died, you were sent, you got, I think 30 days to move off of the canal. You had to move into the Republic of Panama or go back to Barbados or go back to wherever you came from. You said something in the beginning, I think it was said that some of these, you said 93 persons. I know Roman actually said 93 persons were found in 1913 that were amputees. Did all of the people, all those 93 got sent to that farm, or were there people that had to leave their jobs, didn't get any help?
It's a really, really good question. It's, thank you so much. It's really hard to generalize. So if the person was deemed to have been injured in the line of duty, right, that was the language they used, they might be entitled to some compensation, and that might help them to set up with a new job, maybe run a store, something like that. If they were injured outside of the line of duty, in many cases entitled to nothing. And so they would have had to scramble to find, a new opportunity for them, some kind of job that they could do with their injured, with their disability. Now, we also have examples, particularly prior to about 1914, of people given jobs on the canal, even as disabled men, right? So several hundred people I know with disabilities were working on the canal in, I think it was 1914. And they often had jobs that didn't require them to move around too much. So they might be working as a switchman or a flagman, or they might be working in a shop, or one of them I know was helping to make furniture, right? So maybe he specialized in things that he could do while he was sitting down, things like that. So the canal did try, when possible, to offer people those opportunities, but they became harder and harder to come by as time went on, right? They really didn't want to be employing these people on their roles any longer, especially as we get into the sort of post-1914 era. And so your question about what happens to them is really important. I'm thinking of Henry Gordon, who talks about essentially getting his pay cut and then cut again, and then he's finally fired. And I have not been able to find out exactly what happened to him, but he may have been one of these people, as you just suggested, who had to leave the canal zone and perhaps moved elsewhere and had to forge a new living for himself. So part of the challenge of this work I've been finding is tracing people's stories through the records. Often the trail kind of runs dry and it's hard to know what happened to them. So I'm so appreciative of your question. And I'm always happy to talk with people more if they have thoughts about places I should look, right? Because this is, this is a huge part of the story. So thank you.
Caroline,
We'll take
this
a
is
couple
Carmen.
more. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I was gonna say,
And
we'll
I
take-
just wanted to thank you very much for your research and documentation of to record the stories, and it falls in line with what we are doing Pan-Caribbean as Sankofa and the college to preserve the stories. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. We had a question from online too, Caroline. Before the days of first responders and high-speed ambulances and rescue helicopters, embedded medical teams and those kind of things, how did the injured on the canal receive treatment?
What a wonderful question. I'm going back to the National Archives probably this winter. And one of the headings that I'm hoping I can track through the archives is something about ambulances, right? Did these exist? Because to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what was available in terms of the first responders. From some of the narratives that I've come across, it seems like often the men would kind of rush to help one another. And then they did have these hospital cars as well that were attached to a lot of the trains. So I guess that would have served as a kind of form of ambulance. But that's such a great question, because that's actually one of the things that I'm hoping to get more detail about, right, as this research continues. So you know how it is, research is always kind of a work in progress. So if I do find anything in the National Archives that points with more detail about that, I will try to find a way to let folks know. I'll write something about it or something like that, because I think that's a really, really important question. Thank you.
And one more question from online. Did the workers get severance pay, including that included family size, if they agreed to leave the Panama Canal, or was the money just fixed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not seeing very standardized numbers, right? The records again are very patchy. We don't have records from every injury compensation board case as they're evaluating all the details. I'm really not seeing that. It's just these very sort of sparse records. So it's been hard for me to see any patterns, but I do see that sometimes people with similar injuries would get slightly different amounts of money. And I think that family size was probably factored into it, because that's the only way that I can really understand why two people with a similar injury might have received, a few $100 difference in their compensation. So I can only speculate. I'm sorry I don't have a more definitive answer, but I think it was taken into account at least to some extent. But again, I'm speculating a bit here.
All right, and I know there's some other questions and comments, but we're over time, so I'm going to stop us there, and I hope everybody will join me in thanking Caroline again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all very much. And I do want to say, if anyone has a question that I didn't answer or you want more information, please send me an email. I would be so delighted to hear from you, and it's no trouble at all. I would love to talk to you, so thank you.
I can share Caroline's contact information after we're done with everything else and everybody some resources. So thanks again, Caroline. This has been great.
Thank you. Really appreciate
Bye.
it.
All right, and for everyone else, thank you so much if you participated with us today, both in person and online. For those of you who are online, we're going to end our sessions for today. This will be the last online session we do today. We'd like to thank you again. Participation has been great. We hope we've been able to respond to your questions on chat. If we didn't get to your question or comment via chat, we will respond to you after the fact. So we're saving the chats and we're going to make sure we respond to everybody. If you want to join us tomorrow online, we're not having a morning session online. We're having a film screening that we, of course, can't do a film screening over Zoom. We are starting our session tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So join us tomorrow if you'd like. We're going to stop our recording and our live share momentarily. So let me do that now. Caroline, thanks again so much. All right.